Hello there, AP Human Geography students. Let's keep learning all about cities and how important they are for the world. So let's start this one off with talking about world cities. We're going to do an activity in class together where we'll kind of explore what makes world cities so important. But for the purposes of this class, there are 3 world cities, and we're going to identify the winners and what cities would sort of be considered second place. So the world cities, the top tier world cities, are Tokyo, London, and New York. And if I were to somehow rank them on what is the most important, New York would be number 1, London would be number 2, Tokyo would be number 3. But they're all really, really important cities for their respective regions of the world. And then this map also shows you some of the second place cities and the third place cities. But most of them are in the Western world or East Asian world. It's where so much money and interaction happens in our planet. All right, moving on. Yeah, here's another map. It's maybe a little more clear. So London, New York, and Tokyo are all major ones. And then maybe second place ones are Chicago, LA, Sao Paulo, Singapore, and then a bunch in Europe that are kind of on top of each other. Paris, Frankfurt, Zurich. So, yep, these are the most important cities in the world where you can make a whole lot of money. And this is a map that just shows the importance of cities in the United States. This one, it's really given a lot of special attention to San Francisco, Houston, I didn't expect Houston, DC, and Miami, as well as, of course, New York, Chicago, and LA. And then it's cool to just see how these cities are divided, that there's sort of node central cities and manufacturing center cities. So I like that Vegas is on the list. Woohoo! Vegas, we're important, I guess. Yeah, so seeing all these different cities, what they're useful for. Okay, so now let's talk about the concept of gateway cities. I think this is something you'll pick up in your homework, but these are cities that serve as major transportation hubs. A lot of gateway cities today, well, in the past, they used to be port cities. Like, for example, just about every immigrant that came to the United States from Europe passed through Ellis Island in New York City. New York City was kind of the gateway to the United States back then. But nowadays, most people travel by international airlines. And so wherever there's an international airport, that is kind of the gateway into the United States. And not every airport is an international airport, surprisingly enough. There's most of our major airports are international. I mean, the one here in Vegas is, of course, international. But certain airports are national only, and they won't actually accept planes coming in from other countries. They'll force those planes to land in kind of these bigger airports that have immigration and customs and ways to like check people as they enter the country. But the busiest airport in the entire world, surprising fact, is Atlanta, Georgia. Have I ever even been to the Atlanta airport? I don't think I ever have. But it's a very, very big airport, and it's where so many flights happen. It's crazy. But also, New York has 2 international airports. Los Angeles has 1, LAX. I've been to LAX a bunch of times. I've been to the Tokyo International Airport, the Seoul International Airport. I've been to London International Airport. I've never been to Beijing's International Airport, and I've never been to Istanbul's. But my sister, who frequently flies to Africa, her plane like always has a stopover at Istanbul, like every time. So that's kind of this focal point of global traveling. I also know, like in South Korea, they only have 2 international airports, Seoul and Busan. Only 2 ways to get into that country by flying. So yeah, and a lot of countries are set up like that. I know, like also for example, Thailand only has 1 international airport in Bangkok. So many countries kind of have their one gateway, and if that's your only way into the country, well, it's probably going to end up being a major city where a whole lot of money is generated. So let's check some of these out. World's busiest airports. They're basically all in the West and the Far East. Poor Africa, no busy airports. And Latin America only has Mexico City and I think that's Rio, Sao Paulo. I think they share an airport. But yeah, no major airports in Africa. Wow. Ghost airports. The world's least busy airport is Spain, which had 12 passengers in 2012. Ouch. Nobody's going there anymore. But yeah, it's just kind of cool to see where all the really busy airports are in the world. All right, so here's a bunch of planes going into airports. Airports are kind of exciting. You know, usually I always like to have a great conversation with my students. Some kids are like, I love flying. Other kids are like, I hate it. Other kids are like, I've never been in an airplane. So it's just interesting to hear every kid's impressions about flying. And yep, more international airports. And then this is the Gateway Arch in St. Louis, Missouri. But St. Louis, Missouri isn't really a gateway anymore. And yeah, so these are the busiest airports in the world. Atlanta's number 1, Beijing's number 2, London's number 3, Tokyo's number 4, Chicago's number 5, LAX is number 6. So yeah, that's pretty cool that 4 of the top 10 busiest airports in the world are all in the United States. Cool. Moving on. All right, so yeah, we're going to do city models for the rest of this presentation video. I should have already given you guys the handout relating to city models, so I'm just going to explain some of these a little bit more. I'll talk about styles of infrastructure, and I'll talk about Vegas. I'll do that outside of this video in a live session. So, but just make sure you got your city models on hand, because we're going to talk about the rest of those right now. Why do cities look the way they do? And I think this is, Shanghai. Yeah, Shanghai, cool city. Okay, so urban models. Going to talk about the 4 urban models: concentric zone, sector, multiple nuclei. Oh, and galactic edge city. I've actually covered that in the stations activities, so I'm going to skip that one in this presentation. So we're just going to see 3 concentric zones, sector, and multiple nuclei. Let's see what these look like. So, yeah, skip this, sketch the layout of your town. Sometimes I usually like to see if kids can kind of draw the Las Vegas Valley, and we can see which model it applies to. But these are the 3 we're going to talk about today: concentric ring, sector, and multiple nuclei. And I'm going to give you guys some real-world examples of this stuff as well. So yeah, here's just a fancier way of showing them. But hopefully you have the handout, and you put the handout straight into your notebook so you don't actually have to draw these. So concentric zone, sector, and multiple nuclei. All right, let's start off with concentric zone model. This slide called it ring for some reason. But this is a model that was really popular in the 1920s. And the model is never exact. It's going to be hard to find a city in the world that truly does look like a big bullseye. But the concept of the concentric zone model is that at the center of your city, there's what's called the central business district. And just about all of the city models have this in common. And the central business district is the high-rise buildings. It's the quote, downtown, where so much of the work is done. So many people come into downtown to work their jobs every day. And surrounding the central business district, the high-rise downtown, that's where there will be some factories, some light manufacturing, some secondary styles of work. And then right after that, it'll be the lower class residential zone. It'll be probably a lot of apartments that are kind of seen as the not more desirable part of town. And then the next ring that you'll see emanating off of that is middle class residential. So you might start to see some houses. But these aren't like super fancy houses yet. It's probably a bunch of like kind of townhomes. But then after that, in kind of the further outreach of the city, that's where there'll be the fancy mansions and the rich high class parts of society. So it's sort of these zones, and you would see these in most American cities. They'll follow this pattern to a degree. And I've been to many cities across the United States, and I've absolutely seen stuff that kind of looks like this. And I think Los Angeles can be really applied to the concentric zones, because there is the big high-rise downtown part of LA. The next ring off of that is kind of a factory manufacturing zone. The next ring off of that is the lower class. Then the next ring is the middle class suburbs. And then on the outskirts rings, you got Hollywood, you got Malibu. So that's where there'll be the really exclusive residential districts. So concentric zones, bam. That's what it's about. And it's rich people want to have bigger houses. They can also afford to be further away from the city center. So that's what's up. All right. Yep. And here's just another way of looking at it. Concentric rings, high rises in the middle, And then as you get further and further away from downtown, that's where rich people like to live, and then middle class people, poor people, and factories. Okay, and Indianapolis, Indiana is supposedly a great example of this. I've never been to Indianapolis, but I believe my human geo overlords here. So I'm sure if you saw the percentage of renters, yeah, because typically if you are a rich person, you typically don't rent. So as you get further and further away from the city, there's far less people renting their houses. Makes sense? And yeah, it's based off the assumption that the central business district is the center of the city, and that home values increase as distance from the city increases. Usually it's associated with having a larger space for your house as well. But this model assumes that there's like no mountains in the way, no rivers in the way. It assumes that it's all one big flat space. And I guess the question I usually always propose to students is, does Las Vegas follow a concentric zone model? And I'll argue that in some ways it does, in some ways it doesn't. The most wealthy parts of Las Vegas are Summerlin and Henderson, and those are very far away from our central business district, which most certainly is the Strip. But then, I don't know, do the poorest people in town live close to the Strip? I don't know if that's fully actualized. I think that the kind of more low income part of the Las Vegas Valley is North Vegas as opposed to close to downtown. But yeah, it's defined by decentralization and saying that people can kind of get around the city without any big problems. Okay, yeah, you don't have to write this down. This just further defines what these zones are about. I think I've already explained this. Okay, now let's talk about the sector model. So the sector model, it's a very similar style to concentric rings, but rather than having rings emulate from the center of the city is cut into these wedges. And I already highlighted that Latin American cities definitely seem to have these kind of wedges of I don't know, higher class living and more expensive areas, while they have a wedge that's kind of a poor area. And this model absolutely applies to all Latin American cities. But the famous city that the sector model really relates to is the city of Chicago in the United States. But yeah, people noticed that there were certain kind of ways you could map where the middle class areas of the city were, the high class areas of the city were, and the low class areas of the city were. And the sector model typically likes to disconnect the high class area of the city from the low class area of the city. Rich people don't like to live close to poor people. They want to be in their own more fancy part of town. So that's what it's about. So there still is the CBD, but there is maybe a wedge of very upper class, very high living, surrounded by middle class living, and then you've got the factories and the poor people kind of mixed in on the other half of town. And I think to a degree the sector model also applies to Las Vegas. All you got to do is rotate this 45 degrees, and you kind of say, okay, the south and the west part of Vegas are kind of the middle class, high class parts of town, while the north and most of the east parts of Vegas are the lower income and kind of the more factory, more secondary part of town. So this could also apply to Las Vegas to a degree. Yeah, and usually the sector model could apply to maybe if there's like a river or the waterfront. Like I know in San Diego, there's a lot of really high value properties close to the water. And the lower parts of San Diego are as you get further away from the coast. Hey, that's kind of where I'm from. So, yeah. Anyway, I could relate to even more cities about this. And usually I always like it when students are like, Mr. Brown, I'm from this random city in the country. What model does my city apply to? And I can usually kind of look up and deduce some things about your city. All right, so that's the sector model right there. It's just a different way of organizing how you set up a city. And yeah, it's based off Chicago. I just said it. And it counts especially for transportation networks. And let me go back to the model for a second. So in Chicago, especially, I want to say it's the east side or the west side of Chicago. There's not a lot of public transportation, but there's a lot of roads and freeways. So that kind of gives itself the nature of being a more middle class, higher class part of the city. But if there's a lot of public transportation, a lot of easy access for people of lower incomes, well, then they're going to be more inclined to live in that part of town. So Chicago was almost designed by how it structured its public transportation to have kind of a segregation of the rich and the poor. Yeah, so wedge shapes away from the central business district. Okay, and then to go off of that and to kind of relate it to Chicago and to Las Vegas, sometimes these sort of poorer income, these more neglected parts of cities are called the disamenity zones or the zones of abandonment. And I used to work at a high school in North Las Vegas, and I will tell you kids factually, North Las Vegas is the zone of abandonment for this greater Las Vegas area. Because every day going into school, I would consistently see homeless people. I would consistently see trash on the street. And I'm just like, every time I go to Southern Highlands and Centennial Hills, like, these places are generally clean. And there's not homeless people around here. Like, why is it that some parts of town seem to have kind of all the social problems and other parts of town seem to be kind of like thumbs up and super good? That's largely because the city neglects certain parts of the towns. And this is pretty common with just about all cities, maybe even in the whole world. So, but yeah, the disamenity zone and the zone of abandonment is when the government kind of doesn't give an equitable amount of services to certain places. So, yeah, in Las Vegas, I would say it's North Vegas. In Los Angeles, I would say it's South LA and maybe to a degree East LA. In Chicago, it's definitely the south side of Chicago. And a lot of these services that are lacking are just effective ways to deal with the homeless, effective ways to deal with crime, ineffective policing. And here's an interesting fact. 1,000 or more people live in Las Vegas's storm drains. So if you ever do decide to go underneath Las Vegas and check out some of these large storm drain pipes, it wouldn't be uncommon to find homeless people hanging out there. So what is our city supposed to do about it, And our city doesn't have a very big incentive because homeless people generally don't pay taxes. And usually that part of town, people aren't trying to buy houses in anyway. So it's I wish that city government had different priorities. So let's check it out. All right, so yeah, this is Rio de Janeiro. There's clearly a zone of town that's getting a lot of attention from the city government and a lot of services, and then a zone of town, the favelas, that are just kind of terribly neglected by the city government. Okay, and Skid Row. This is a pretty common term, and I know there actually is a place in Los Angeles called Skid Row, but to a degree, every city in the world probably has a Skid Row. And it's just kind of a statement saying, like, this is the part of town where it's not so great to live. And it's the part of town that people aren't getting the attention and the help they need. So, yep, this is what you'll see around Los Angeles today. A whole lot of tents. And here's a person who's totally down on their luck. And, yep, here's some tents. And this is kind of rude. And I know they've been doing this in Los Angeles. Rather than actually help the homeless people, they just build walls around them. And they put, like, blackout curtains over these fences so that when people drive by on the freeway, they don't see all these homeless people living in tents on the side of the road. I think that's really shameful by Los Angeles. Why don't you help these people out? Here's people sleeping on a mattress on the street. Gotta help homeless people somehow. Not all people are homeless because of drugs. Apartment condemned, no family, kids stay in school, do your homework, parents save for a rainy day. Yeah, so can't put it all on these people. Some people just get a really sense of bad luck economically. Okay, and then here's the crime map of Chicago. It's pretty clear that the south side and to a degree the west side of Chicago have a whole lot of crime going on in them. And I usually do show this clip from a Chicago news source saying that they no longer have ambulances respond in South Chicago. There's no hospitals down there, and the ambulances take too long to help people. So the city of Chicago, you really got to do something to help people down there. And the vast majority of South Chicago is African American. And I think there's definitely some racism plugged in there. Like, here's one of these victims of some violence in South Chicago. It's got to help these kids out. And then, here's some of those buildings in South Chicago just getting kind of abandoned. And then top 10 murder cities in the United States. Number 1 murder, Chicago. Gotta do something about it. And yep, here's some, I think these are pictures here in Las Vegas. These are just some homeless people living in North Vegas, kind of on Skid Row. Here are those storm drains underneath the Las Vegas Strip. And if you go underneath them, what are you going to see? You're going to see some homeless people living in the storm drains. Pretty hardcore. All right. Yeah, here's just some more stuff about the sector model. So there'll be kind of the high-class part of town, the middle-class part of town, the central business district, and maybe the low-class part of town. And, well, here it has another middle district, but usually the low-class part of town is kind of all isolated on one side. I know the city of Detroit is set up like this as well. All right, and this is Indianapolis, saying that it kind of has the sector model to a degree as well. So it looks like median household income. Where do all the rich people in Indianapolis live? They all live on the north side. And where do the poorest people live? Well, they tend to live on the south side. And that's not uncommon in many cities in the United States. Okay, so the multiple nuclei model. So this is the model that no longer really puts a lot of attention to where the central business district and where specific groups live. It's kind of like everything gets a little randomized. And it largely has to do with the importance of the car and just people spreading out in all directions. And another point about this model is it's spreading out where the important centers of the city are. And I think to a degree, San Diego, where I grew up, follows this because the sports stadium was kind of in the north middle part of town, and then the airport was in like kind of the far east part of town, and downtown I guess was kind of south middle. So everything was really spread out, and you kind of had to have a car if you wanted to access all that the city had to offer. So yep, and also part of this, airports are further and further away from cities. Like, I hope I've already said this, but the Tokyo International Airport is 4 hours by bullet train north of Tokyo. It basically is on a whole other part of, it's so far away. It's unbelievable. But that's what it's about. Okay, so here's what the multiple nuclei model looks like. See, I guess there still is the official central business district, but various parts of the city are now just spread out all over the place. So people can kind of access whatever they want to access. And yet saying high-class residential is still as far as it can be from low-class residential. That's going to be common with all of these models. And middle-class residential is kind of in the middle. So, yep, that's that. Multiple nuclei models. And, yeah, you don't need to know all 9 districts. Just know that the traditional downtown might not be as notable as it would be with some cities. It's that everything's now getting more and more spread out all over the cityscape. Okay, and then, yep, transportation and urban growth. So the original downtown, usually there's these rail lines or public transportations, freeways, that all sort of focus on the downtown. And, ooh, this is a cool concept. You'll see these ring roads surrounding most major American cities. And, yeah, Indianapolis kind of has this too. It has this kind of big, almost circular square ring surrounding the majority of the cityscape. So that's just going to be pretty common when it comes with freeways and highways. All right, so the peripheral model. I don't know if this is an official model here, but oh, well, hold on. Yeah, I just talked about ring roads. So yeah, it's these urban areas where there is the traditional city, but surrounding that is this big old ring, and that's where you'll find suburbs and people living. And to a degree, Las Vegas applies to this. I mean, we've got a freeway ring kind of around downtown Las Vegas. I know we do have the 15 that cuts through the middle, but this idea that there's this ring freeway that can connect everybody in this big kind of circle around the central business district. So, yep, there's the peripheral model. Big old ring connecting everybody around it. And this ring road usually is kind of the main artery of the city. So, cool. And the central business district's always in the middle. All right. And then Kansas City, Missouri. Yep. Do they have a ring road? They certainly do. But then there are a bunch of roads leading into the actual city itself. But I would call the ring this larger ring that connects, the cities of Wilcott and Bonner Springs and Alexa. So, yep, all that's there. All right. I'm going to save this for the next video. Peace out.